All right, we are live. Today's topic is going to be on abortion. This is Wes. Alan's already joined us. Welcome, Alan. And Duncan. So today I think we'll try something different rather than just discussing, a video. I think that the arguments pertaining to abortion are sufficiently familiar to people that we can begin at kind of a common ground, and then extrapolate from there. What are you guys' thoughts?
Well, currently, I'm thinking about a completely different topic because I just noticed that, I'm resting my head on my hand, and there's all that propaganda about how many times people touch their face in a day, and I'm like, okay, but how many times does this count as? Like, if my head is just on my hand for an hour, how are we counting that? Is it one touch? Is it a touch every half a second or so? Or I don't know. It just the numbers that they come up with seem preposterous. Yes, I agree with you, Christopher.
I don't know if I agree with myself. Okay. So generally speaking, some arguments, not all, begin by, because I want to call it like a diverse palette of arguments. Some begin by discussing an axiomatized system of logic, and it may be implicit in the argument, it's not necessarily stated, from which evaluative statements are made in association with life, which is often described nebulously. And particularly, it is said to be that life is defined to be instantiated at the moment of conception, right? And by conception, it is often stated to be fertilization. I think that the first remark I would have is that such a definition doesn't really seem demonstrative of someone who's very well learned in biology, because at the moment of fertilization, many things can occur in the biochemistry that can result in a chimera, a splitting, resulting in twins, and so it's not even clear if you're talking about a single entity yet. And so there's often a discussion of potential for life and whether we should value it from the assumptions, of course, that we should. So my first question to you guys is what your thoughts are pertaining to what life is, because centered to this discussion, part of it, right? So some people shift the discussion towards an argument of possession of their body, but part of this is associated with what life is, but more importantly, not just life, but shall we say personhood, because perhaps it's not enough that a thing is living. Perhaps the question is also what constitutes personhood across time. Can we define a continuity of these things across time? And from those definitions, make inferences about this argument.
Yeah, and I definitely think that personhood is probably a better metric than life, because one of the interesting thoughts that I had when just thinking about the nature of pregnancy and of what do you call it? Oh fuck, I forgot the word. Oh, gestation. The gestation
That's right.
period in life is that pregnancy is actually very similar to a parasitic infection, and in many ways it actually is. It's just a parasitic infection that happens to be built into the life and reproductive cycle of humans. But when you think about it, it's like a growing fetus parasitizes the resources of its host body while it itself is a different body that is developing inside of it. We don't necessarily have any respect for the parasitic life cycles of any other organism that might infest our bodies, and we take full control over the means to excise them without really any argument of the moral implications of doing so. So it's
But before procession, right? I think we need to try to, if we can, concretize what we mean by life. Simply because whatever axioms ethically we set up, we'll be interacting with that definition, right? And so one of the problems in modern science is it's very difficult to define life. So something you run into very often in when you get abstract into the weeds of particular topics is our definitions for them are counterintuitive in that they don't necessarily describe the thing in reference in its entirety, but rather they rely on a logical structure for implication of necessary conditions that thing should have. In other words, the desire for a definition sometimes is not necessarily to actually determine the thing in its totality, but rather to give us a marker of things that we can reliably identify, if possible, that can determine whether or not epistemically this is the thing we seek to we seek to affirm the existence of. The trouble is, that linguistic reference to a thing doesn't necessarily imply the fundamental existence of the thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to talk about what people mean in these kinds of conversations when they talk about life, because while most of them have not set out to establish a very solid definition, there are common themes present in most of these discussions about life and about the ethics of abortion. I think when most people have those conversations in just like the layman world, what they're talking about is like the life of these animal cells, and separation of life occurs when there is sort of a sufficient separation of genetic material or just of body. Like if it's another organism that's being operated by like another set of controls, another mind, so to say.
So like modern biology relies on like properties, as I said, in lieu of the definitions. And some of those properties are homeostasis, right? Organization, having metabolism, having the capacity for reproduction. But these are not necessarily sufficient. Physicists have tried to extrapolate it to a thermodynamically motivated definition of just something that replicates within a sustainable degree of error. But even so, then the question becomes, if a person is incapable of reproduction, are they not a living thing? But furthermore, it's a question of, does a definition need attached to it a property of identity? Which what I mean by that is there's much more to life and living than just a thing having the properties to live. There's also distinguishing living things from each other.
Exactly right. And like, this is one of the things why it's quite tricky with this, because as you're saying, like the definition of life is a little bit sketchy, and then we can't just say, is it life? Then we have to give it these rights, because that means we're going to be giving human rights to every living organism. So we have to then define what is human life, which makes that hard question even a little bit harder, I feel.
Yeah, and I want to clarify, when I said that defining the moment of conception as the moment of life beginning, specifically fertilization, I'm not saying that there couldn't be some discernible moment of conception from the supposition that it's more complicated than people might initially surmise, but rather that it would be more difficult than people might surmise. It's not as simple as soon as you have an egg and a sperm, you've got a baby. And the logic is also problematic, because it's not even true that given a fetus, it's necessarily going to be born, right? The probability varies. It's very likely these days, given modern healthcare, that most people will be born. But it's kind of like saying that you and I running a race, it's almost assuming we will finish the race, when although it's not likely, it is possible neither of us may finish. There may not be a winner.
And that's an interesting point, actually, because I wonder if the option of abortion had existed and been safe enough to pursue for the general public back in the days when infant mortality was significantly higher, at some points, like more than 50% was the infant mortality rate, then they more than likely would have had a much different outlook on abortion, of just like, if it can save the limited resources that you already have for you and your family, and given that the child isn't likely to make it to adulthood anyway, I imagine that many people would have been much more pro-abortion under such circumstances, simply given that the probability of life maturing to a sufficient degree was just not as great as it is today.
I don't know. What do you think, Wes?
I'm not sure about that.
because you could flip that argument on its head a bit and say that if you have a less chance of surviving to adulthood, then you want as many chances to get to, like you wouldn't be so keen on an abortion because that would be preventing you from rolling the dice again.
I don't know. I don't know if we can rely solely on probability. It's not that it's not related. It's just that we have to resist the temptation to reduce this to a unidimensional or minimal. A good argument does identify common denominators fundamental to a particular topic and hone in on them. That's true. But it's we have to be careful not to minimize the number of variables and simplify the argument to a degree that we lose traction to perhaps some of the more important implications.
Yeah, but I also believe like it's important to examine whatever position that we take within its context, because the efficacy of those positions may change based on parameters in the environment or at different stages in time. That's more the point that I was trying to make.
Because Edward, I think it's Trifonov. I don't know if I pronounced the name right, but he's basically said that he's tried to define. He looked up basically approximately 300 definitions, according to modern biologists, and he found so many variations that he stopped basically at 300. But what he found, and that's not meant to be a reference to 300 Spartans, although but he basically found some common denominators, and it's not to say that the most common definition is even the most correct at all. There's no logical implication there, but he found that among most of them was just the implication of reproduction, right? Of course, the problem there is, as I said, it doesn't adequately describe what we mean by living, right?
It doesn't tell us what personhood is either.
Yeah,
right.
That's the other thing. Mm-hmm.
And that's
the important part. Because that's where the human rights part comes in.
Yeah, perhaps, I don't know. It depends. It depends on our axioms. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not. Right. I mean, but this is part of the difficulty of the topic, and I think that there seems to be a prevalence of people, who seem to simplify the topic when it's not at all that simple. It's very complex.
Oh, no.
No,
it's one of the reasons for its complexity is that life is an emergent property, and it's just something that I've noticed whenever you're dealing with emergent properties by nature of the definition, it makes it very difficult to point to something and determine a cause, because life, at least in terms of the physical sciences, it comes from what is essentially dead chemistry, the predictable interactions between elements and compounds, and at some point there develops a degree of complexity that is enough to give rise to a quality that is more than simply the sum of its parts.
I'd like to actually expand on that, because I think it's a good point. But there's something really difficult, like lingering in the background behind emergent phenomenon that are very seldom that is very seldom understood by people. And it's this: if you understand Einstein's special and general relativity, and if these ideas of space-time are correct, the situation becomes much more complicated, because our definitions of those phenomena have to account for the fact that it seems if they're associated with physical phenomenology, those things are only defined at a certain scale on certain time intervals. What I mean by that is if there's a minimum amount of time it takes for whatever we define, the integrated information processing that physically instantiates, that would be the physical instantiation of thinking, right? If you choose epsilon equal to, say, a Planck second, if that's the smallest denomination of time, you will find the holes in your consciousness. And so it's not clear that there is a single ontology, so to speak, that you can describe yourself fundamentally existing on. It's not clear. Are you conscious at any time, or only across partitions of time?
Yeah. That's when you're trying to think of consciousness as purely a physical phenomena, you break it down into those very small component pieces and just try and figure out, okay, on what level does consciousness exist? Consciousness may exist over the course of an hour with a frame of reference of time preceding the way that we experience time, but if you're going frame by frame down at the smallest instances of time over which it's possible to determine that an event has happened, it's like, yeah, can you map consciousness?
Yeah, it's kind of like a question of, do atoms exist, at the level of quarks and leptons? And modern quantum mechanics, as far as their implications on state vectors for permuted orders, of the universe, it's difficult to argue from the wave equation a single ontology. There's a lot of debate, about whether you can describe the universe as a singular ontology, and so describing life and many things that, and by the way, Alan, it's not that this requires a reductionist perspective. Not that you said that. I just want to make that clear for viewers. Even if you try to argue like the instantiation of consciousness, meaning you're allowing for there to be a metaphysical, parameter per se, but you're also making a claim of like a physical aspect or biconditional component, something like that. Even in other words, even if and when you have a physical parameter even associated, as a relation, this issue of scale will be applicable. Are we defining abortion currently, and is the goal to discuss ethics of it? So basically the idea right now is trying to concretize life and personhood, thinking about properties that could define some semblance of continuity, things like that. If you want to come aboard, we're happy to have you.
I mean, it's definitely like this kind of discussion is important, although it's very far afield from what most people think about when they just encounter like the problems of abortion and that debate. But I think it's important to have this kind of background, because otherwise, people just end up sort of butting heads if they have two conflicting opinions. There's not really a lot of room for compromise. But
yeah, when I did my sort of research, it sounds like a bit. When I did my little study on abortion to try and figure out which side of the fence I was on, I found a lot of it was a lot easier to study than this particular this aspect of it. What is life? When does life start? Was so nebulous and very hard to track down. So I've never really concretized my answer. I always sort of placed it around the point where we get the higher brain function to actually consider it to be like our consciousness to exist. But I don't know. It's all just guesswork for me. Albeit I've studied a little bit of stuff on it, but it's just just throwing darts.
What I'm trying to say is, if consciousness is a phenomenon, for example, it may be difficult to define it at a point in time, but only on changes in time.
Yeah.
If a phenomenon is thought of as like a permuted order between states of the universe, and even if time is like just a parameter with an asymmetrical orientation, representative of the orientation necessary for the mathematical models that model those permuted orders, to model them as they do in the order that those permutations occur. In other words, the asymmetry of time may not be evidence of its fundamental existence. And William, I dropped a link for you if you want to join us, because I'm interested to hear what you would like to say. And I think we still have enough space for an additional person to participate, although it does get a little crowded.
Yeah, max of 6 I read on the website. But I do think that kind of probability and speculation into the future comes into play at a certain point once we actually develop a position on when this sort of quality of sanctity of life exists. Because I mean, we mentioned this off stream, I think, but it's like at some point that exists. At some point, we adopt the social responsibility of you can't go around killing people, and especially not children. In fact, like that's considered more heinous than just killing like a random adult. So it's like, at what point does human life take on that quality of sanctity? And what are the implications of that? Because the common argument against it, the most common one, is a woman's right to basically control over her own body. And naturally, in the gestation process of humans, the fetus is developing inside the body of a woman. So at what time does she have the right of control over that to essentially end it, abort it? And at what point does she no longer have that right? Or does that ever happen? Should we establish that they continue to maintain that right until the moment of birth?
I think, one question I've often had is, what is a right?
Okay, well, that takes it down to a whole nother level.
Because people often say that they have a right, but it's a nebulous term that.
Yeah, I think most of the rights, at least that we imagine to be present in society, come from a similar vein of philosophy to Jean Locke's social contract, where it's like the rights don't inherently exist, but we choose to do as much as we responsibly can as a society to enforce them and to guarantee them. The conversation on which rights we have changes over time. We have constitutions and we amend constitutions to define and to protect those rights. And in fact, this is the subject of one of those constitutional amendments. But like, it's those liberties that enough of us enjoy and wish to protect as individuals that we cooperate as a society in order to protect them. And typically that involves some type of legislation.
Yeah.
What are your guys' thoughts?
I think, well, hold on. I think what he said was all, I was agreeing with everything. I haven't really had much things to say about it, but I always wondered, as he was going, where is personhood, I think, and sapience. At what point is a baby a person and sapient enough to have rights? And the way you used right earlier seemed to be like an ethical standard rather than a legal standard, or the other ways you were saying, I have a right to do this or a right to do that, meaning I am somehow permissible to do that by an ethical standard.
I suppose
it's part of that, I think, was where.
So on the question of personhood, many philosophers have taken a crack at attempting to describe.
I don't know where it's at, but
Locke tried to define personhood as like a continuity of memories that are kind of an integrated pattern across time. And the problem with looking just at memories in association with consciousness is, whatever that means, is just that suppose you have two identical sets, right? He tried to ascribe this not only to continuity but also to identity itself, right?
Yeah.
But one property of identity is that it not only tells you about the continuity or change or something across time, and not necessarily across time, but just in permuted orders. But it also, at any particular term or time, it can distinguish things from each other. But if you have identical sets of memories, Locke's definition just fails to distinguish those people as different people. So if you have different instantiations of the same memories, it's hard to say that those are different people through Locke's definition.
Well, if we split a person,
and notice that sets. I'm sorry.
If we were to take a person, split him into two, then
what do you mean? Just slow down. What do you mean split him into two?
I mean, if we could somehow just magically clone a person,
right? But understand that there are many.
And they have the same memories.
There are many.
From then on, have different memories, though.
So what you mean by split?
Would it be the same person?
So what you mean by split is technically multiply.
Multiply somehow.
Okay. So if you increase, right, and that's potentially a problem, right? Because then it's not clear. If you assume for all future times t that they have the same set of memories, unlikely though that may be, it would be difficult to determine them apart from each other.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's
Also,
kind of
according to Locke's definition, a sufficiently sophisticated AI would be able to get personhood.
And some philosophers,
Yeah.
So some philosophers conjecture that, like Nagasena, that you can't. This is like more of a. It's not a Western philosophy, but that you can't describe things fundamentally as by just referring to collections of things in a particular order. And so you relate things by the processes that kind of connect the states of the things. So, for example, a mango is not the same as the planted seed from the tree from which it fell, right?
Yeah.
But nor is the mango you consume the same as the remnants, or even the mango from the first bite you take. But the chain of how those things are connected is often how someone like Nagasena might say. So in other words, like, are you the same person as the person that your mother raised, right, when you were a child? If you don't have the same memories, we might have a problem, right? So
even with the ship, for example, at what point do you keep repairing a ship and putting new
right?
boards on the ship?
Nagasena might say it's not about the similarity, but about the process through which you could track the change.
Yeah.
Right. And so the continuity of that process. The problem is here we have, again, if we have two instantiations of the same phenomenology, the same process, we then fail again to determine the identity of these things from each other at any particular term in the permutation.
So are we saying that the point at which human life receives its sanctity, and this idea of sanctity of life is more of a social construct. It's one that exists nowadays under current conditions. It's one that may not have always existed throughout time, or in certain circumstances, human life and even the lives of children is seen as kind of expendable. But under sort of the rules of the society in which we currently operate right now, there is a point, a very vague point, because of this debate around it, at which human life receives an element of sanctity. Are we saying that that is the point at which a human being can be said to have personhood? Are those two one and the same?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's very
at what
tricky.
Point is a baby up in the air? At what point is a baby able to think as I was gonna say personhood. I was trying to put it in a different way that maybe it'd make more sense.
Well, I mean, I think we need to try and qualify that too, if we can, because like a person's mental development carries on throughout pretty much their entire life. We can't say that there is a time at which it is now complete, but when does it have the quality of individual person? Yeah.
And this is what I'm getting at. This is why before we even dived into the discussion, it became clear to me that definitions for personhood and life, and in lieu of those definitions, properties of continuity and persistence across time or between states in a permuted order of states for a particular system would be really important, but also counterintuitively very difficult to concretize.
So if you go with Locke's idea of the people being a collection of memories and that's linked and all that sort of stuff, then very early on in the conception of a child, they wouldn't qualify for personhood because they don't have the brain function to actually make and create memories and things like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Although that's fair. Although that's fair.
memory.
Like I said, I don't think his definition really gives us identity.
I'm not saying I'm not saying it's concrete and final, but I'm just saying that's just thought.
Right. Yeah. But also it's like we don't want to overlook the claim that people have a potential. And I'm not saying potential is a valid claim as much as, it's very difficult to like look at all of these parameters and in a genuine exploratory, attempt to motivate questions, address them.
Yeah, I mean, but potential is an important quality to whether or not it is the determining factor in how you proceed. If you're considering abortion, it should be acknowledged that like there is a not insignificant chance, and perhaps a more likely chance than otherwise, that if left to its own development, this fetus would become a person, would become a human being with tract in life all their own. And by taking the action of abortion, you are eliminating that potential. It's not to say that it necessarily would have happened, but it is to say that now it isn't. It can't.
Yeah, true.
You've taken that.
But you see, can't without could have suddenly doesn't sound like it makes any argument.
Oh, it's not saying that it was impossible for it to.
No, but do you understand what I'm saying?
Happened.
If it's if it's not clear whether or not there existed a set of possible contingencies from which you've narrowed it to one now, right? If it's not clear whether that's the case, the argument seems to lose its appeal in some ways.
I don't think, I mean, at least not for practical purposes, I don't think so, because it's like in those instances with modern medicine and technology, it's more likely, though I have to actually look up numbers to be able to defend that claim, but from what I know now, I believe it's more likely that a fetus will actually develop to
that's not what I don't think I articulated well what I meant. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying independent of the probability, right? If something didn't occur, right, does that mean it ever could have occurred? That's not clear. In other words, what I'm asking is we don't even know if there's a singular ontology to the universe. We don't know if what was going to occur had to occur, or if it wasn't the case that was going to occur.
Okay, but that is valid. That is a very different discussion of like trying to say, is the universe deterministic? And it's like, well, okay, but right now we're having a practical discussion over like the ethics of abortion, and it's I don't think that we can depend on, well, let me figure out whether or not the universe is deterministic and I'll get back to you.
What I'm trying to say is not quite even that it's deterministic, right? Because maybe you don't know the outcome that occurs, but that there aren't multiple paths. They're not quite the same dimensionally, right? They're slightly different. I think determinism, although it can be conflated with a singular path, doesn't necessarily, because it could be that there's one and only one path per se. Maybe path isn't the right word. There's one and only one state of, for a permuted order, but that particular state is something of an indeterminacy, right? Maybe that's a possible. So it's not clear. I don't know. Because I guess what I'm saying is beneath all of this is also a repository of assumptions about the nature of causality itself.
Mm-hmm.
Does it really matter though if a baby has a potential?
I don't know.
Or a fetus has a potential to be a baby?
I don't know.
For abortion, because at the same time we're also taking the baby or taking the fetus at the time it is a fetus, not as it is a baby later.
I mean, yes, that's what we're doing, but that's why
ethical implication is it okay to take a fetus?
Yeah, I mean that's why potential makes it into the argument, though, because like if we were living in a world where like all like 100% of fetuses would just die or cease to exist, then it's like, well, okay, then I don't think it really matters, because we're not voiding them of that potential for life. But
so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just, because that potential does exist of like the fetus developing into a person, then it has to be involved in the argument. Whether or not we consider that potential to be of crucial importance, it still has a place to say that we are now denying the opportunity for this particular potential to be fulfilled.
If we relax our discussion of this from, like, considering state vectors and quantum states, like just the two permuted orders of states of the system, then what we really like to concretize perhaps what we mean by potential is really, we're looking at the interval of time over which we're defining our consideration. Because obviously, if we let the time get small enough for any one of us, it's hard to argue that any one of us at those small, over those partitions of time, depending, if consciousness is a process that is defined on an interval of time, but not at a time, it's hard for any of us to really justify our own consciousness and persistence, right? And so what I'm saying is potentiality really enters the argument as soon as you start to realize that some things may be defined only on a particular scale and a particular reference frames. And so the potential can be thought of as the scale of space-time that we are discussing in a particular reference frame as it pertains to something that's hopefully well defined, right?
Yeah, and it's important, because like the more we talk about it, the more I realize the debate isn't just about personhood and at what stage of development someone can be said to have personhood, but of the idea that before they ever develop into a person, we might take an action that prevents them from doing so.
Because the idea is, before this defined personhood, what we would like to try to do is expand the interval of space-time, and have intersecting light cones that assume certain trajectories, right? And so then we can argue the existence of consciousness at this time, and in this region of space. But it's, I think that's, if you had to make it a little bit more precise, that's kind of what's going on. It's of course conjecture, because it's not clear whether or not future speculation is substantive speculation, materially. I don't know. And as soon as you start to discuss the material difficulties of probability theory and whether it can materially instantiate physically, the problems are compounded, So I think it's gonna be funny, because a lot of people probably come on these expecting like more of the same, right? And what I mean by that isn't literally the same. That would be logically fallacious. But I'm pro-choice, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think like that aside that you just made accurately sums up the nature of these discussions, because it's like, no, it's not like the butting heads. It's like we work the philosophy and the logic into it at various stages, and just the fact that you took time out of your own statement that you were making to point out like a potential logical fallacy. Yes, that's exactly what happens here.
Well, to be honest, if I took the time to correct and try to make clear how people could either misinterpret what I mean because I didn't articulate it well enough, or literally better ways to state what I did state, but because I haven't planned this out and it's live, I wouldn't write it this way. I don't think I would be coherent as a speaker.
Yeah, well, I also feel like most of the ways that you're afraid people will misinterpret you, nobody is ever going to misinterpret you that way, because they're not thinking about it the way that you're thinking.
Possible, but people love to straw man. They're very good at finding what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And convincing themselves.
Go ahead. Generally give what they wish for, too.
I've been trying to say something for so goddamn long. Sorry, but the cussing. But Andrew actually sort of pulls it up in this statement. It's like, we've been talking about this sort of stuff, and we haven't touched on the mother's rights. And when we were talking about the potential of humans,
we did. We started. We kind of killed the conversation as soon as we asked what a right was.
Yes, sorry. But what I want to go down the path of just for a second is, we were talking about fetuses basically being potential humans, right?
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, a mother isn't just a potential human; she is an actual human. So it's like the winning of the lottery and things. Do we actually take money from the person who's won the lottery and give it to other people. You know what I mean?
All right, so this sounds rigorous, and it sounds like you're concretizing, but you're not. You see, because here's the thing. Let's just unpack this. Because we haven't escaped the problem. Is she a person at a time or over a time? You see, because if I change the scale and let the time get small enough, it's not clear whether a person is the quarks and leptons in a Planck second.
Fair enough.
And so we have the same issue of potential, because what we would have to do is define, right, an interval of space-time, and that is a permuted order of states, even if we were allowed. And so it's difficult, right? I hear what you're saying. I'm not saying it's not.
I think that for practical considerations, we don't really need to look at it on such a level, because when we have these kinds of discussions, we do so from the frame of reference of people's day-to-day lives, from a very practical perspective, where people are not necessarily considering the mother as a collection of these physical instances of quarks and leptons and things.
Which isn't to say that's what defines a person, right? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying like that. I'm just saying it's very complicated. It's fucking difficult. And
yeah, but I mean, from the reference point and from the scale of time of like human development and day-to-day life, the mother has already received that sort of sanctity of life, and in addition, potentially the social right of self-determination for what goes on with their own body, for the right to take action to affect their own bodies as they see fit.
So here's what I pretty much see, and this is why I think we started the conversation with these, because central these topics are: what is life? What is personhood? How are these things defined? What are their properties? How can we establish, instances of continuity? And from that, put together a tenable way to address questions like the one Andrew posed. Because if we don't have that and then beneath that, axiomatize the system of ethics by which to make those inferences. Because we don't have those things set up.
Yeah, but we also, for the most part, we know the context of the conversation that we're having, because like I
don't know. Maybe you do. Maybe you're wiser than me. I don't know I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's the point of like discussing things for practical purposes, is that you go into it with kind of this assumption of an agreed upon context for the positions and the actions that you're debating. But overall, this is a very practical discussion, because we're not going to look at it at like the root fundamentals of existence and whether or not we can accurately define all possible states of the universe to try and determine the ethical implications of abortion. We're going to look on it at a very surface level, sociological context of like what effect does this have on all of the people involved, and included in that, do we include the infant as a person, or the fetus at whatever stage as a person? Do they weigh in the argument at all?
Yeah, but I think you'll concede that like to address those things is to, it seems, require some degree of a definition of like personhood, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have to have like a definition certainly within the context, but we also can't dismiss positions out of hand with this very this great abstraction.
No, I'm not saying that if we can't abstract that we can do away with the argument, as much as I'm pointing out we may think we can avoid it, but I don't know if we really can. In other words, I think that by telling ourselves, okay, let's let this be the working definition, I don't know if that implies epistemically that we're suddenly talking about the same thing that we intended to talk about.
Well, and that may very well be true, but I'm trying to look at this from the perspective of a layman entering this argument, or
be careful now. Those people are listening.
Well, it's or a mother, like a mother who is actually considering abortion as an action to take. Most of them do not enter into such considerations with this vast background of like philosophically examining what does it mean to be alive, what does it mean to exist, at what frame of time do we have these instead. Those are all kind of assumed to have like these working definitions of day-to-day life, and so I believe that's the most practical area in which to have this kind of conversation.
Although I think you agree, if we're arguing practicality, why don't you just assume your conclusion? I mean, it saved you even more time, right? I mean, now that technically does not follow, right? Because then you have to argue what is the practical implication of the assumption of your conclusion. So it's just a joke. It's not a literal retort. It wouldn't be correct to be a retort. And there is potentially something substantive in what you said. It's just it's fucking complicated. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and it's important to realize too that it's like that's pretty much the reason why people don't really get anywhere with this debate, is because they don't often take the time or possess the background to rigorously define all of these parameters that they just kind of assume to exist in a certain way and in a certain reference.
Well, I want to make clear, this isn't something that people have yet figured out as far as I'm aware. This is still many of these things are very, but by controversial at the same time, that doesn't mean scientists don't have a fucking clue what they're talking about either. No. I don't want people to think like, oh, therefore, we don't know anything. I don't know, but it's fucking complicated.
As I was saying before, this is one that, like, as we sometimes defer to the experts or whatever like that in these sort of things, the experts are still sort of like standing around shrugging a bit, going, "Yeah, well, it's complicated." And they're like, "We were just saying."
But basically, like, the whole point of that discussion is to say that like the assumptions that people make going into arguments and conversations like these may not be accurate, and they may not be the most well reasoned, but they are nevertheless the assumptions that make up the context of this debate as it exists for the general public. So if we want to introduce any kind of a practically functioning solution, it has to also practically function within that context.
Do you know what I think? You know what I think is kind of going on in the background here? I wonder about how many subjects this is a potential problem for. I wonder if it's symptomatic of the fact that we use discrete symbols in reference to so many of these things, right? And the constraints on discrete systems of logic, that there will always exist at least one boundary proposition, right? The inability to truly refer in a substantive, comprehensive way with a discrete system of logic to the thing you mean to reference seems almost a constraint.
Well, it's I want these discussions to be somewhat beneficial, at least, because if we always come back to that point of like, oh, well, I guess we can't draw any real conclusions ever about anything, then it's like, well, I don't know that there's a lot of value in these discussions, because we're throwing out ideas and then just being like, yep, and I guess we can't do anything with them. So it's like,
I think that it would be disingenuous for me to give people even to attempt the facade of convincing people that I was remotely confident. Hey there.
Hey.
In what I believe.
And that's very fair. But at the same time, I believe the point of these discussions is to develop
motivate questions.
Well, yeah, to motivate questions, but to develop a more refined perspective. And if somebody has counterpoints to the perspective that we achieve either as a group or individuals, that becomes part of the discussion. But the goal of the discussion is a progressive one. It's to build on a position.
Here's what I'm trying to point out is if there are constraints on discrete systems that are systemic, right? You can almost guarantee the existence of a point to which they can counter. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And it may not be referencing a fundamental property of the thing we mean to reference, but just an inherent symptom of the discrete language we use to reference that thing. And so it's a question of whether we're arguing over a system of logic or and the constraints of it, or the thing itself.
While true, that's the point at which we start to look at things from a practical perspective, like not so much whether they are absolutely logically accurate, but of the overall implications for society and people's day-to-day lives, where they may not be considering the logical accuracy of their positions or their actions, but just the effects, the consequences that they have on day-to-day life.
I don't know, and that doesn't mean you're wrong. I don't know.
Anyway, William, how are you?
I'm doing well. I downloaded an app that lets me use my phone as a camera and still use my microphone attached to my computer. So
yeah, this is a problem. We're gonna have to cover you up because you're looking too good. You're making the rest of us look bad. We might have to.
Sorry about that.
Your lighting is excellent, man. What are you doing?
So have you been
running through his PC, I think.
Have you been following our conversation thus far?
Yes, somewhat. Although I missed out some of the middle section because I was engaged in figuring out my setup here. But
gotcha.
Most of it I caught on to. So the question I have is, are we going to talk about whether abortion is specifically right or wrong, or just whether it's practical for society, or whether you believe that what is practical for society is right?
So maybe recommendation is we try to table the obvious problem of without definitions for personhood and life. That's difficult to do, and to say, okay, suppose we could decide what those definitions were, right? Let's not try to define what they would be, but rather let us assume that a definition exists and try to make the minimal assumptions that we can about the definition that would allow us to at least make some inference ethically about the thing in question.
Okay.
Right. I mean, but obviously there are complications because like the definitions may inform us as to the constraints that we would try to infer ethically. Right.
Right. So, but so ethically, when we talk about ethics in and of itself, what are we even referencing? Are we referencing a moral, like, objective system, or something that is non-objective and completely subjective? And if so, what is it based on?
We're going to have to start with axioms either way. So I don't know if that's it's not quite the same as being subjective, but let us say, I think a good candidate for an ethical theory is probably the one I'm trying to axiomatize, the one pertaining to the existence of permissibility clauses and goodness of experience clauses defined on a domain of discourse consisting of moral agents, right? There's that basis, we claim, with the probability amplitude of the state vectors spans the set of all ethical phenomenon, where ethics is just a relation between applicable moral agents.
Okay. First of all, who do we know William? Does anybody in here? Is he a friend of anybody?
I don't know. Who is that guy?
No, that guy, he's just some plebeian.
Oh, okay. Well, it's like I wanted to know, like, what kind of context is he coming in here with? Like, does he know Christopher and how Christopher talks about things?
So William is
yeah, we need to warn him about that.
William is a mathematician like me. Yeah, he's a mathematician like me.
Okay.
Oh no, we got another.
Just kidding. But it's okay.
Oh no, the mathematicians are multiplying. Oh wait, they always did that.
Well, you'd be surprised. We don't seem to multiply that successfully, given our current. But we usually keep things accessible, and that's also just because if we tried to apply, our tool set, we might be very limited in the scope of things we could actually address. Because you have to have very precise parameters to apply a lot of the theorems and definitions we have.
Well, I think actually attempting to address the point, comes up with a bit of an interesting problem, because we spent a lot of time talking about potential, but we seemed to kind of assume that there is a certain point at which potential is applied. Perhaps that was like the union of sperm and egg, where all of a sudden you have diverse genetic material that's starting to divide and become its own organism. But what about the potential prior to that point of like the union of sperm and egg? By denying that, are we somehow similarly denying the life the potential to develop along its course?
What if I don't use protection? Is that okay or not?
Why do you have to ask the question?
Just wondering, because you're going on potential again.
You see the face?
Right.
Did you see his face when he asked that question?
So this has been argued that, I mean, there are some people that would argue that you can't use anything, and you basically can never waste any potential. It has to all go to reproduction or not be
That's how
at all.
Catholics teach. So
yeah, you're not supposed
that's
to.
That's why I said it, because Catholics don't take birth control.
Is this because life?
How far does this go?
So here's my question: like,
and is it rational at all?
Where are we anchoring the reason for this? Are we assigning the value to life? Like where? Because it's in those details that we could start to pull this apart.
Yeah. That's why I asked the question. Wasn't just to make Alan.
Because if the question is one of valuing life, and we assume that we have an adequate definition of life to say here's a living thing, the question would become, are cells living? Right? Do we have to worry about the potential for cells, and what happens when we consume plant matter? Those are cells. Are we?
Yeah.
Is there something about plants that we don't value the potential for?
Well, and it's interesting because I think we have made some progress. It's like at some point there is a point at which sanctity of life is a quality that is applied to a person. Before that, you deal with the potential of developing sanctity of life, right. and before that, you deal with a moment in time at which that potential is important to consider. So like for practical purposes, like there is a beginning at which point we can say that the potential is now important to consider in debates over whether or not abortion is ethically viable.
Right, guys, but remember, okay, we don't want to make a fallacy of composition here. Like when we think about a person at a time, that may not be something over which a person is defined. They may be defined across a time or across like a certain minimum scale, right? In other words, I don't know if we can safely ignore the physical scale and how that relates to the system.
Well, I mean, we don't have to ignore it, but let's choose a scale at which events of thought and of personhood are actually of relevance. So it's like we're not dealing with Planck seconds. We're dealing with like a scale of like, I don't know, like quarter seconds or something.
This is why
that scale is kind of what we then mean perhaps by opportunity. You see what I'm saying?
I mean,
that is to say, if we have the parameter t like grow sufficiently large to a scale where we have a minimum threshold for the applicability of the definition. That's what I'm saying. You can better define potential as that minimum scale. Because it seems less nebulous that way. I mean, it does risk like losing some of perhaps what people intend when they argue that, right? But
it's like there is an event which, if we only, for the purposes of this discussion, if we're only considering time on a particular scale at which these sorts of human events can be sort of quantified, that there is an event, there is a moment in time at which the potential of personhood is now so significant that it factors into the argument of abortion and whether or not it's ethical to end a developing person's life.
Yeah. When I say yeah, it doesn't mean I agree necessarily.
It's like, when I say I agree, it doesn't even mean I agree.
It's probably true too.
But yeah, it's like if we examine it like that, then I think we can make some progress on saying like, okay, it seems like conception is probably like the moment of fertilization when the zygote is formed is probably the best place to say, at least in my opinion, I don't know, Christopher can refute this if he feels like it, that is the point at which this potential begins to apply, where it becomes a consequential factor. So then the question is, at that point, does that potential outweigh any right that the mother might try and exercise to abort the developing person? And if not, then at what point does it outweigh that right? At what point is the sanctity now inviolable?
Unforgivable. Unforgivable, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Howdy.
So when we're talking about potential, what specifically do we mean by that? Because there's a lot of different degrees of potential. So if we mean that if you input the actions that are necessary for reproduction and then stop there, then it would happen all on its own. Because that's not even true, really. You have to do more than just that. So at
if
what
you don't
point
eat food,
do the person's actions create enough of a potential that their further actions are then judged based on them having crossed that threshold?
So here's a question. What if, like, we argue, now this is a fringe case, so it's not meant to be representative of most cases, but it's meant to explore perhaps the nuance of what's kind of, tangled up in this multivariable problem. But what if we imagine a person who is sufficiently sick but is impregnated, and they're sick such that it's now nebulous whether or not it will be tenable that they can make it to a particular term?
I mean, it does factor in, because we're not, for practical purposes, it doesn't seem very viable to make the argument that abortion should never be medically considered, never even be like a socially acceptable option. There are some situations at which it becomes either the life of the mother or the life of the child, or potentially just the life of both. It's like, if you do not abort this pregnancy, both of you are going to die. So it's like in those situations, like, abortion is much more medically viable. But I suppose that's an important parameter to define from the outset, is like, under what circumstances are we even considering the discussion?
Well, all right, so I don't think I
abortion?
said very clearly what I meant to motivate. So, like, let me unpack what I meant. What I mean by that is, suppose that the person is older and less fertile.
Yeah.
Right. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm trying to point out that it doesn't seem that it is enough that we've fucked, and then there's been fertilization, and there's been some point at which we have the requisite conditions for the cells to then, given the right supply of nutrition. That's what I'm saying, is you have to consider all of the other things that have to continue for that to actually instantiate.
And really, you got to keep going until they're at 18, because somebody's got to be an adult to them.
Wait, is that like a perverse? Is that like a perverse statement? I'm confused.
Well, I'm trying to think how I mean that.
Well, like, I think you were saying it's like, at that point is when they gain kind of the full autonomy of independence, but that too is a very arbitrary point that isn't even universal across like the spectrum of humanity. It's just we pick a date that we're like, that's 18, good enough.
So what I'm trying to say is, we're not looking at boundary conditions to argue the marginal case. That's not the point. The point is to ask and motivate questions about, well, how likely is this really? And is it really as simple as a thing that is necessarily going to occur, even if we relax our questions about, ontologies associated with the universe and things like that, right? If we relax all that, we just simplify it to, okay, I'm pregnant. Is it really as simple as it's all smooth sailing from here? Because if that's the case, do we even need medical doctors to, monitor pregnancies?
What I was trying to say with my comment a little bit was that this is more complicated.
Yeah, but
because it goes beyond just, do I have the baby even? It goes, what happens after the baby is born even? Yeah, you can give it up for abortion, or you can try to take care of it, and that's
give it up for abortion,
which is not an easy thing for most mothers.
And to be clear, I just want viewers.
give it up to adoption.
I just want viewers. I just want people viewing to understand we're not arguing the marginal case here. That's not what we're doing. We're asking. Yeah. And when you think about boundary conditions, sometimes what you're looking for is isolating a particular variable to hone in on what's going on, and then tease that apart a little to see if then it has an implication about the more general set of cases. Okay, so it's not, we're not sitting here thinking about we're not arguing that if and when there are fringe cases where some people don't carry to term, then it has some implication about most people that do make it to term. We're trying to think about whether or not there's potentially more of a preponderance of nebulous sets of assumptions than we might have initially surmised around the claim that once we have this minimum, at where the minimum set of things that maximize the likelihood that this will come to be a person, where is that? And that's, of course, relaxing all the other questions we've motivated up to this point, right?
All I know is it seems to be pretty complicated. And picking a point in time of even, Alan tried to say conception, I think, was a time of not for everything, but for the time of
the time at which potential seems to be important to consider, because it doesn't seem at all tenable or practical to go around trying to examine the potential of pregnancies that haven't even started. It's like by not having sex as often as possible, are you denying the rights of all these children to live? And it's like, okay, well, that kind of goes beyond the scope of practicality. But once there has been some type of initial fertilization, I think that's the point at which the potential becomes a matter for discussion. And then we reach the kind of debate of
two people have talked about it before the conception.
What about opportunity costs? Really? What about opportunity costs? Should we not be having twins, or should we be having twins?
Yeah.
Because one problem here, and again, this is an issue of arguing potential, is when you argue opportunity costs, you're making implicit assumptions, that are ontological. So tabling that though, should we or should we not, and this is obviously contingent upon growth rate, the population, the carrying capacity of the environment, all of that, of course, the system of differential equations, but should we or should we not, if we're thinking about potential, right? Because what I'm trying to say is, all right, so here's the thing. Let's consider the potential of currently living things. And again, that's defined across some time, according to some system of differential equations, et cetera. And let us imagine now that let's factor in growth rate, and let's imagine a situation where we don't want people fucking and having kids because it would fuck us over if they were born.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
already.
Right. So then our appeal for potential starts to become, well, whose potential? And we start to get into the nitty gritty of opportunity cost. It's going to be us or them if we're not careful.
Well, I mean, and that's an illustration of how kind of important context is, because I've made the position in previous statements that there is a point of the inviolable sanctity of life, but that's contingent on our social
shit.
Well, yeah, it's like on our social values at the time, because all of a sudden, if we're dealing with like significant overpopulation and population density control becomes more socially admirable, then there might be propaganda being like, abort your pregnancy today, help save the resources.
Well, here's the thing. Okay, we would like to avoid even that, right? Which means we would like to actually negate the potential itself.
Yeah,
we'd like to kill it in its crib, right? Before it even, I mean, sure, there's the abortion issue. Like, in other words, we don't necessarily get the consequent of, okay, if you're pregnant, because you could argue that people just like to incentivize abstinence or something else. It's not quite it's not a strong counter, but it does pose a potential problem if and when you argue that people should not regulate it whatsoever, right? That position compounded with this possible case, especially if a person, takes that position, it's going to get difficult very quickly. But it also poses potentially a problem for people who argue a right over their own body. You see, because then if a large set of individuals take that stance without regard for the implications, if our system of ethics is concerned with those implications, as they relate to population growth, we again have a situation where it's not as easy as my body, my choice. I don't know about that. If you guys want to have 10 kids or not have 10 kids, it seems that it's not as simple when there are, 7.5 billion people. It's suddenly not as simple as whether it's your body, your choice, it seems, if and when there are economic consequences.
Okay, so now all of a sudden we've kind of reversed the argument where it's like, it's my body, my choice to have as many children as I want. If you want to have more children.
I guess you can also imagine a situation where we need people to be born to carry the workload to expand the economy, right? You can also have a shortage of people. That's also possible.
Well, but I think when discussing ethics, the more important consideration, rather than the idea of social responsibility, whatever it is if there is a certain inherent ethical quality to life that should be respected. If it's not just a matter of it being your body. Once there is now another body developing inside of you, it is now the concern of both of those bodies.
Well, the concern, I don't know. I hear what you're saying, and I don't even know what it means to have choice. But
we're not going to go there.
I feel like
I don't even know what it says. Are you married?
I feel like a lot of these conversations are you guys like preventing me from going down like rabbit holes.
Yep. You caught on to it, Chris.
There are ways to prevent abortion.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean there are, and then that's
Planned Parenthood. That would have been nice if we didn't.
I do also like the idea that Alan was sort of suggesting in his comment that you were saying before, is it ethical, but also if the situation changes, does that then change our ethics? So, like, if we have an overpopulation problem, is it then ethical to be able to have an abortions? But say if we had an underpopulation problem, is it no longer ethical? I think.
Well, and I think a lot of where like the conservative ideas behind one side of this debate, where like the sanctity of life is considered to be so absolutely inviolable. I mean, a lot of it comes from religion, but even a lot of those religious values came from the need of children in order to survive a population, because infant mortality was so much higher and most people never made it to adulthood. It was kind of considered women's social responsibility to have children as often as possible throughout their lives in order to sustain the society.
Right. You see my point is like, if you imagine, for example, okay, imagine like I'm going to use Yusra because she's probably chill with me, like using her as a joke publicly. Imagine Yusra and I are the only people left to breed, right? And pretend she's like not interested in that. She's like, no, I don't, dude, stay away, right? And so we're in a predicament if and when we want to proliferate the population, but it's suddenly not. It's complicated now, and I'm not saying
it doesn't end well for you, sir, does it?
I don't know. Okay, I'm just saying. I've totally put myself out to dry here because now people can say he's a rapist, whatever, right? But I'm trying to say that.
Well, I mean, it's an important thing in any discussion of ethics and morality. It's like that's why I've said it's so important to consider the context, because in a context like that, you could make an argument. Maybe it wouldn't be correct, but you could make a legitimate case for the ethical soundness of rape, which is like, it sounds so bizarre to say.
I don't think that'll work.
You guys sound like you're prepared for the desert argument, desert island argument. Quite a bit. Like, island with a girl. I gotta figure out how to word this right.
Well, I mean, because it's like at that point you're saying, okay, does your right to not be raped outweigh the right of the human civilization to continue? Because those two are now mutually exclusive.
Here's the thing.
I'm not sure that the human society
that may not be an ethical situation. See, one of the problems is sometimes we assume that there's always an ethics. It may just be that that's not an applicable situation where ethics is possible. It may just be a shit situation either way.
Yeah, and either way,
the human society has a right. Period.
Yeah.
And
right.
Necessarily, what is the human society if it doesn't exist? We're talking about the right of a non-existent entity.
We're talking about potential now. See, we're back on potential.
Right.
Potential society. Oh dear, this is brilliant.
Yeah, well, not just that, but okay. So relating to this, what she's saying, somewhat, we were talking earlier about like the possible economic consequences of having children and how it can affect other people. I think that it's safe to say that we're not currently in a time where it falls clearly one way or the other, where you are harming the population if you have more children, or you're harming the population if you don't have children. It's very unclear. Yeah. And I don't think, as I haven't looked at the most recent calculations here, but I don't think we've quite hit the carrying capacity for human population on Earth.
We've got the whole fucking Midwest.
I feel like has 10 children right now. We would.
Right. There's a problem with what you said. It's that you haven't specified the rate, though. You see,
the rate of reproduction.
Right. If we fuck like jackrabbits, we're gonna have a fucking problem real quick.
Right. Exactly right.
And so it's this game theory situation where like what you do is only okay if other people are not doing certain things at the same time. But okay, so the issue is we're talking about whether it's good or bad to do this, or right or wrong, or practical or not practical. It's kind of unclear what exactly we're talking about, actually. But,
welcome to the chat.
Welcome aboard, sir.
But we're talking about measuring these actions up, and I'm not sure that you could reasonably say that any person now would be able to determine with any clear accuracy whether or not these things will have an overall positive or negative effect in society across all the factors considerable. I don't think it's possible to actually decide the answer to that problem, because I don't think any person has enough information to do so. And so because of that, I don't think that saying that the person should be using that information is really viable at all, because I don't think that there is enough information on which to base a decision. And so
the guy that ate the bat that was undercooked should have eaten it then.
Okay, I don't think that even happened. I don't believe that that's how this virus fucking spread.
I mean, I wouldn't say that he should have eaten it, but
he shouldn't have considered the information.
I also wouldn't say that it's true that he shouldn't have eaten it.
Understand that I'm being facetious. I'm not saying that's your literal argument. Right.
I know.
I'm not saying it's your literal argument. I think it has merit, but I think it does risk looking at this from a utilitarian perspective, right? So it's contingent on if that's what you're defining your axioms of ethics to be.
Well, no.
It's
I'm saying that we shouldn't look at it from the utilitarian perspective because we don't have enough information to look at it from that perspective at all.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying the
impossible to
criticism is that if someone does,
Right.
right? So it presupposes people will. And what I'm saying is,
I mean, my problem with this particular stance is that on an individual level, it doesn't seem likely that anyone will ever have the complete information to say whether or not carrying a pregnancy to term will be beneficial or harmful to society. So it's like, even where there are social implications, like when infant mortality rate was high enough that we desperately needed more children for society to thrive, or in the future, if we deal with overpopulation and we really kind of want to discourage that, we still can't say on an individual case-by-case basis that this pregnancy is going to have an overall net harmful or net beneficial impact on society. So I don't think that it can really make an effective argument either way.
You're right. I think you're right. But at least in those situations, you could try to weigh the likelihood of it falling one way or the other. You couldn't. It's kind of like I mean, assuming that probability works at all. But so you could say, okay, this thing is more likely to happen.
He and I have already discussed that, like in separate conversations about probability theory.
Yeah. But so if you take the law of large numbers, then you can't measure anything on an individual basis. But if you have a lot of babies in this same instance or era of society where it's like, this is probably bad or this is probably good, then over time, most of the babies will either be useful or not useful. And you can use that to make a decision with regards to the individual. You can set up camps for them. You can set up camps for the babies, and they can help them concentrate. Right? That's the idea. I see where you're going.
Well, I mean, as one of the problems, and this being super tangential and not in any way like forming a conclusion about this argument, but one of the problems with humans in particular is that even after gestation, infants are dependent on their parents and communities for every element of care for so damn long. It's like deers pop out ready to walk and run and eat shit, and just like they can live at a pretty full approximation of their life just from the get-go. Human babies are fucking pathetic, and like society has to take care of them for so long. It's like, grow up, get a job.
And so Andrew asks, is Aristotle's theology relevant to discussion, e.g. one's potential person? Oh man, here we go about the definition of personhood and its properties persistent across states again. Oh no. You know, I don't know, man.
I think it's very relevant to it's a discussion we were having earlier. Now I don't know what the discussion is. But.
All right, so how about this then? I promised Yusra I would conclude this within a reasonable time T, such that T was sufficient to allow me to go on a run still with her. So let's say we transition to the after party where guys, the shirts can come off and stuff, and the math can come out. And anybody in the comments interested in joining in, we'll drop the link and we can
Rebecca
end the live broadcast.
Would like to.
Yeah, if you guys are interested, come on.
Polly?
Yeah.
You want to put the link down there real quick? And
are we still recording the after party? Do we have that set up yet?
Let me look into the software of that, because I want to I could record it and then I could set it to private. Do you want me to do that?
I think it would be valuable to have
as additional content.
Yeah, as additional content, or if nothing else, just for reference, so we have something we can go back and look at and say, is this worth?
You might explain something really well, and we could put that somewhere else, like in another video, saying Chris explains this or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to conclude this broadcast. So let me just end.